Everyone in the estate warned me about the Alpha Heir. "He's a deaf monster," the senior staff whispered. "He's lived in absolute silence since birth. He can't hear your apologies, and he certainly can't hear your screams. Stay out of his way." I was just a battered Omega, sold to the pack to scrub the grand halls. I had already learned that making noise only invited more pain, so working for a man who lived in a silent world felt like a twisted kind of safety. I moved around his quarters like a ghost, keeping my head down and hiding the fresh bruises the other guards gave me, until the night the cruel head guard cornered me in the cellar. The heavy stone walls trapped us. When he threw me violently to the icy floor, knocking the breath from my lungs, I didn't scream out loud. What was the point? No one cared, and the only Alpha powerful enough to stop him was 3 floors up, locked in his impenetrable silence. Instead, as the guard lunged for me, and I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed with all my soul in my mind, "Please, please, someone help me!" It was a silent, desperate prayer to the moon goddess. I expected nothing but darkness. I didn't expect the massive iron-reinforced cellar doors to suddenly explode off their hinges, sending a shockwave of dust into the air. I opened my eyes, trembling. Standing in the ruins of the doorway was the Alpha Heir. He was panting heavily, his massive chest heaving, his usually empty eyes now glowing a blinding, furious gold. He wasn't looking at the guard. He was looking directly at me. The guard scrambled back in terror. "My lord, I was just disciplining the maid. You can't even hear." The Alpha Heir didn't use his voice. He had never spoken a day in his life, but suddenly, a deep, earth-shattering rumble vibrated directly inside my mind, dripping with apocalyptic rage. "Get your hands off my mate!" Silence was the heaviest currency in the Alpha King's estate. For the servants, it bought survival. For the guards, it bought favor. But for the Alpha Heir, silence was a life sentence. Everyone in the sprawling, cold stone fortress warned me about Kael. They spoke of him in hushed, terrified whispers, always checking over their shoulders even though the subject of their gossip couldn't hear them. He had been profoundly deaf since the day he was born. The Alpha King, a tyrant who valued perfection above all else, treated his only son not as an heir, but as a defective monster. Kael lived entirely in a void, locked away in the upper wing of the estate, navigating a world that moved around him like a silent film. He was known to be volatile, unapproachable, and dangerously strong. "He can't hear your apologies," the head housekeeper had warned me on my first day, shoving a rough gray uniform into my chest. "And he certainly can't hear your screams. Stay out of his way, Omega." I took the warning to heart. I was just a battered Omega, sold to the pack to scrub the grand halls and keep the fires lit. I had learned long before arriving at the king's estate that making noise only invited more pain. I was a ghost in a worn apron, keeping my head bowed, my scent suppressed, and my fresh bruises hidden beneath the high collar of my dress. Working in an environment dictated by the deaf heir's oppressive quiet felt like a twisted kind of safety. I understood silence. I lived in it too. Until the night the head guard, Silas, cornered me in the cellar. It was late, long past the hour when the lower staff was supposed to be in their quarters. I had been sent down to the sub-basements to retrieve a specific cask of aged wine for the king's table. The air down there was suffocatingly damp, smelling of wet earth, rotting wood, and the metallic tang of old blood from the adjacent dungeons. The only light came from the flickering iron sconces bolted to the heavy stone walls. I was reaching for the cask when I heard the heavy, deliberate scrape of a boot behind me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I turned. Silas stood at the bottom of the narrow stone staircase, blocking the only exit. He was a massive, A scarred beta with a cruel smile and eyes that always lingered too long on the Omega servants. He reeked of stale ale and malicious intent. "Working late, little ghost?" he slurred, stepping off the last stair. I took a step back, my spine hitting the rough wood of the wine racks. "I was just leaving," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I don't think you are. You've been ignoring me all week. It's disrespectful, and the king doesn't tolerate disrespectful Omegas on his property." He lunged. I tried to dart past him, but he was too fast. His heavy, calloused hand clamped around my throat, cutting off my breath. He slammed me backward against the stone wall. The impact knocked the wind out of me in a violent rush. My head cracked against the granite, sending a spray of white-hot sparks across my vision. I slumped to the icy floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Silas stood over me, unbuckling his heavy leather belt with slow, deliberate movements. My mouth opened, but I didn't scream out loud. What was the point? The walls were 4 feet of solid stone. The other servants were too terrified of Silas to intervene, and the only Alpha powerful enough to stop him was 3 floors up, locked in his impenetrable, silent world. A physical scream would only anger Silas more. It would only make the beating worse. Instead, as he reached down and grabbed the fabric of my dress, tearing it at the shoulder, the sheer, paralyzing terror broke something open inside me. I squeezed my eyes shut, digging my nails into the frost-covered stone, and I screamed with every fractured piece of my soul. I pushed the terror, the desperation, and the agony out of my physical body and hurled it into the dark, silent ether of my mind. "Please!" It was a silent, blood-raw shriek to the moon goddess. A plea into the absolute void. "Please, someone help me!" I expected nothing but the cold floor and the heavy weight of the guard. But then the air pressure in the cellar shifted. It didn't happen slowly. It was a violent, atmospheric snap, like the second before a lightning strike. The flickering flames in the iron sconces died instantly, plunging us into near darkness. A split second later, the massive iron-reinforced cellar doors at the top of the stairs didn't just open. They exploded. The thick oak splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces, the iron hinges shrieking as they were ripped from the stone archway. A shockwave of dust and debris rolled down the stairwell. Silas stumbled backward, dropping me as he drew his silver-tipped blade, peering up into the swirling dust. I opened my eyes, trembling on the floor, and looked up. Standing in the ruined archway was Kyle. The Alpha Heir was a towering silhouette of lethal muscle and unbridled fury. But it wasn't his size that stole the remaining breath from my lungs. It was his face. He was panting heavily, his broad chest heaving under his dark shirt. His hands were clamped agonizingly over his ears, his fingers digging into his own scalp as if his skull were tearing apart from the inside. His normally empty, desolate eyes were completely transformed, glowing a blinding, supernatural gold that cut through the gloom of the cellar. And falling down his sharp jawline, catching the faint light, was a single, shimmering tear. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a falling star. He looked like he was experiencing a miracle that was physically tearing him in half. Because for the very first time in his 22 years of existence, Kael's absolute silence had been broken. He had heard a sound. He had heard me. Silas was trembling now, his weapon shaking in his hand. "My lord," he stammered, holding up his free hand in a pathetic gesture of surrender. I was just disciplining the maid. She was stealing. You can't even hear what I'm saying, but I swear. Kael didn't look at Silas. He didn't even acknowledge the weapon. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his hands from his head. His glowing golden eyes locked directly onto mine, burning through the shadows, pinning me to the floor with an intensity that made my heart stutter. In the space between us, the cold air seemed to warp. I felt a strange, terrifying pressure building right behind my eyes, a sensation like a heavy, warm weight settling into the deepest part of my brain. It was an ethereal thread, crackling with raw, ancient power, weaving itself instantly between my mind and his. Kael had never spoken a day in his life. His physical vocal cords had never known the vibration of a word, but suddenly, the void in my mind vanished. A deep, earth-shattering rumble vibrated directly inside my skull. It wasn't a thought. It was a voice, dark, resonant, and dripping with an apocalyptic rage that shook my very bones. "Get your hands off my mate!" Silas didn't even have the chance to raise his silver-tipped blade. Kael moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of a predator who had spent his entire life hunting in the dark. There was no battle cry, no roar of challenge. The deaf air simply crossed the ruined threshold of the cellar and struck. A single, devastating blow from Kael's fist connected with Silas's jaw. The sickening crunch of bone echoed off the stone walls, but Kael didn't flinch at the noise. He couldn't hear it. Silas collapsed like a severed puppet, unconscious before his heavy body even hit the frost-covered floor. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the cellar was still thick with the suffocating scent of my terror and the sharp ozone tang of Kael's awakened alpha aura. He stood over the fallen beta for a fraction of a second, his chest heaving before he pivoted toward me. I shrank back against the wine racks, instinctively throwing my arms over my face. I was conditioned to expect violence from the powerful, and Kael was the most powerful and unpredictable force in the estate. But the blow never came. Instead, the icy air was replaced by a wave of radiating, furnace-like heat. Large, calloused hands gently gripped my shoulders. I flinched, opening my eyes to find Kael kneeling in the dirt before me. The blinding, furious gold in his eyes had dimmed to a swirling, anxious amber. He was studying my face, his gaze darting to the bruises on my neck, the tear in my uniform, the trembling of my bottom lip. Safe. The word didn't come through my ears. It bloomed inside my mind, a heavy, warm pressure that tasted like copper and felt like a heavy woolen blanket settling over my shivering shoulders. He wasn't using language as I understood it. He was projecting the pure, unadulterated concept of safety directly into my consciousness. Before I could process the sheer impossibility of it, Kael slipped his arms beneath my knees and my back, lifting me effortlessly against his chest. I gasped, clutching the lapels of his dark shirt. His heart was hammering against my cheek, a frantic, thunderous rhythm that belied his stoic expression. He didn't look back at Silas. He simply carried me up the splintered stairs, disappearing into the labyrinthine shadows of the king's estate. We moved like ghosts. The upper wing of the fortress was strictly forbidden to lower staff, and the guards avoided Kael's corridors out of deep-seated fear. The journey was a blur of towering stone arches, flickering torches, and the dizzying sensation of the new, invisible tether pulling taut between my mind and his. It thrummed with residual static, a chaotic hum of Kael's adrenaline and my lingering shock. Finally, Kael kicked open a pair of heavy, intricately carved doors and carried me inside his private quarters. He kicked the doors shut behind us, the heavy iron latch falling into place with a definitive, isolating thud. His sanctuary was completely unlike the rest of the damp, echoing fortress. It was vast, but entirely insulated. Thick, plush carpets absorbed our weight, and heavy velvet tapestries lined the stone walls from floor to ceiling. To someone with hearing, the room was acoustically deadened, swallowing every footstep and breath. To Kael, it was just home. He set me down gently on the edge of a massive, fur-covered bed, retreating a few steps immediately to give me space. As the immediate danger faded, the reality of what had just happened crashed down on him. The telepathic link between us flared with a sudden, jagged spike of panic. Kael stumbled back, his hands flying to his head again. He pressed the heels of his palms against his ears, his jaw clenched in agony. Pain. Bright. Too much. Tearing. The concepts flooded my mind in a chaotic rush, accompanied by the mental image of a white-hot blade splitting a dark sky. He was pacing like a caged wolf, his breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. The bond was overwhelming him. He had lived 22 years in absolute, undisturbed silence, and my psychic scream had violently ripped that void apart. I realized, with a sinking heart, that our bond was unregulated. Every spike of my own fear, every racing thought, was echoing inside his head, amplifying his sensory overload. I had to be the anchor. I took a deep, shuddering breath and closed my eyes. I pushed aside the memory of Silas, the throbbing pain in my neck, and the cold of the cellar. I dug deep into the core of my being, finding the smallest ember of calm, and I forced it to expand. Quiet, I projected outward, imagining my mind as a smooth, dark pool of water. I visualized reaching out along that crackling silver thread that bound us and wrapping it in soft silk. I am here. We are safe. Breathe with me. Kael froze in the center of the room. He dropped his hands slowly, his chest shuddering. He turned to look at me, his golden eyes wide with a fragile, heartbreaking wonder. It stopped hurting. He sent back. The transmission was smoother this time, less of a jagged spike and more of a steady, rhythmic pulse. The bright tearing. You made it dark again. I didn't mean to hurt you, I whispered aloud, my physical voice hoarse. He tilted his head, watching my lips move. He took a cautious step forward, then another, until he was standing just inches from my knees. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and pressed the tips of his fingers against the side of my throat. I felt your mouth move. His mind whispered against mine, rich with curiosity. But the bright tearing didn't happen. In the dark room downstairs, you didn't move your mouth. But you tore the world open. What was that? What did you do to me? I looked up at his striking, scarred face, realizing the absolute depth of his isolation. He wasn't just deafened to the world. He had been completely severed from the very concept of acoustics. He didn't know what a scream was. He didn't have a vocabulary for pitch, volume, or tone. He had experienced my telepathic cry not as a sound, but as an overwhelming physical force, a blinding light, a crushing weight. It was a scream, I breathed. He frowned, feeling the vibration of my vocal cords beneath his fingertips. Scream. What is a scream? I placed my hand gently over his, keeping it pressed to my throat. I needed to translate my world into a language his mind could comprehend. I needed to map the sensory landscape he had been denied. A scream is a color, I projected, closing my eyes to make the mental image clearer. I pushed the memory of my terror down and replaced it with pure sensory data. And a scream is the color of lightning. It is the feeling of a jagged rock dragging across your skin. It is the taste of blood in your mouth when you fall. It is sharp, and it is sudden, and it is meant to break through everything else. Kael's eyes widened. His thumb stroked my pulse point. Yes, lightning, jagged. It broke the black. I am sorry I broke the black, I sent softly, projecting a wave of gentle, soothing warmth. He shook his head vehemently. No, do not be sorry. I hated the black. I didn't know anything else was there. He pulled his hand away from my throat and pointed to the massive stone fireplace on the far wall, where thick logs were burning merrily, sending sparks up the chimney. He pointed to the fire, then tapped his own ear, looking at me with an unspoken, desperate plea. Tell me, his mind demanded, a hunger underneath the command. Tell me what it is. A tear slipped down my cheek at the profound tragedy of his request. The Alpha Heir, the most feared man in the territory, was asking a battered Omega to explain the universe to him. I focused on the fire. I listened to the hiss of the sap, the popping of the embers, the low, steady roar of the flames consuming the wood. I gathered those sounds, bundled them up, and translated them across the silver thread. The fire, I projected, sending him the sensation of standing too close to an oven. It sounds like the feeling of dry, cracked earth. And he stared at the flames, his golden eyes. He stared at the flames, his golden eyes reflecting the light, clearly mapping my translated sensations onto the dancing visuals. He was hearing the fire for the first time through the proxy of my soul. He turned back to me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He pointed to the large, arched window, where a harsh winter wind was battering against the thick glass, rattling the lead panes. The wind, I continued, my mental voice growing stronger, more confident in this new, secret sanctuary. The wind sounds like the feeling of falling backward into a deep snowbank. It is a hollow rush. It is the ache in your chest when you inhale freezing air. It is the color of pale blue ice. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back, absorbing the symphony of sensations I was pouring into his mind. The tension in his massive shoulders finally began to unravel. The oppressive, crushing silence he had endured for a lifetime was being filled, note by note, sensation by sensation. When he opened his eyes again, the intensity of his gaze made my breath hitch. He took the final step, closing the distance between us, and knelt on the plush carpet between my knees. His massive hands reached up, gently cradling my face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones, wiping away the tears I hadn't realized I was still shedding. And you? Kael asked. His mental projection was no longer chaotic. It was focused, reverent, and incredibly tender. He pressed his forehead against mine, his nose brushing my cheek. What do you sound like? I let out a shaky, physical exhale. I didn't need to translate this one into abstract concepts. I let all my walls down, opening the floodgates of the mate bond, and allowed him to feel the pure, unvarnished essence of my voice. I projected a steady, unwavering beam of golden light. I sent him the feeling of sinking into a warm bath after a freezing day. I sent him the smell of fresh rain on pine needles and the profound, heavy sensation of a heart finally finding its home. This is my voice, Kael, I whispered in his mind, wrapping my mental projection around his like an embrace. This is what I sound like. A profound, a shuddering sigh ripped through Kael's massive frame. He wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face in my lap, and for the first time in his silent, brutal life, the Alpha Heir wept with joy. Time lost its meaning in the heavy velvet cocoon of Kael's quarters. The hearth fire slowly burned down to glowing orange embers, casting long, shifting shadows across the thick carpet where we still sat entangled. The adrenaline of the cellar had finally bled out of me, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The ethereal silver thread connecting our minds had stabilized. It was no longer a crackling, chaotic wire of static and shock. It had settled into a steady, pulsing river of shared consciousness. But a river flows in two directions. As Kael held me, his own exhaustion began to dismantle the iron walls he had spent a lifetime building around his psyche. He was a man who had never been able to share his burdens, then forced to carry the crushing weight of his isolation entirely alone. With the bond now wide open, his absolute relief at finding an anchor caused his rigid mental defenses to slip. I didn't mean to pry. It happened in the space of a heartbeat. The warm, pine-scented comfort of my mental projection was suddenly pierced by a freezing, metallic dread. My physical vision blurred, the dim light of Kael's room instantly replaced by the harsh, blinding gray daylight of the estate's training courtyard. I gasped, but I wasn't looking through my own eyes anymore. The vantage point was much lower to the ground, a child's height. I felt the phantom sensation of a heavy wooden training sword slipping from my small, blistered hands. There was no ambient noise, no clash of steel, no shouting warriors, no wind. There was only the suffocating, heavy pressure of the silent void Kael lived in. Then a massive shadow fell over me. The blow came from behind, vicious and entirely unprompted, and it struck the back of my knees, sending Kael, and me, a passenger in his memory, sprawling face first into the unforgiving dirt. The taste of copper and dust flooded my mouth. A massive pair of leather boots stepped into my field of vision. I tilted my head up, my neck aching to see the Alpha King. The king's face was twisted in absolute disgust. His mouth was moving in a furious, spittle-flecked roar that Kael couldn't hear. The king didn't use sign language. "Get up, you defective whelp!" The king. "Get up, you defective whelp!" The king hadn't projected the words, but the sheer, venomous intent of the Alpha's aura carried the meaning perfectly. The memory fractured, splintering into a dozen agonizing flashes. I felt the stinging humiliation of the pack elders looking right through Kael at the banquet tables, as if he were a ghost. I felt the brutal, agonizing beatings in the sparring ring, administered under the guise of toughening up the broken air. I felt the utter, paralyzing loneliness of sitting in the dark, year after year trapped inside a glass box while the world violently tapped on the outside, demanding things he could not give. And it was a lifetime of being treated as a disappointing object, an embarrassment to the bloodline. I jolted back into my own body with a sharp intake of breath. Kael had torn himself away from me. He was pressed against the carved wooden leg of his bed, his massive shoulders hunched inward, his knees pulled up in a defensive, almost childlike posture. He was trembling violently. The shame radiating from him was a toxic, suffocating cloud that burned through our link. "Broken," his mind whispered. And it wasn't a voice this time. It was a jagged, bleeding shard of thought. "Now you see. Defective." He squeezed his eyes shut, turning his face away from me. The most feared lichen in the territory, the monster everyone warned me about, was just a deeply wounded boy who had been beaten for a silence he didn't choose. I ignored the throbbing ache in my own bruised neck and crawled across the carpet. I didn't stop until my knees bumped against his boots. I reached out, prying his large, ill-calloused hands away from his face and pressed his palms flat against my chest, right over my racing heart. Not broken, I projected fiercely, pushing a wave of brilliant, defiant warmth through our tether. Never broken, only surviving. He shook his head, a single rough sob tearing at his chest. The silence was too heavy tonight. The trauma of the memories was drowning him. Words and abstract concepts weren't enough anymore. He needed something deeper, something that bypassed the cruel logic of the Alpha King's abuse. I closed my eyes. I didn't use my physical breath. Instead, I reached into the deepest, most sacred vault of my own memories and pulled up an old lullaby. It was a song my mother used to sing to me before she was taken away, before I was sold to the estate. I began to sing in my mind. How do you sing a melody to a deaf man? You don't use notes. You use the world. It is a river, I whispered to his soul. I translated the gentle, swaying rhythm of the lullaby into the sensation of being rocked on a calm, moonlit sea. The melody swelled and dipped in my mind, and I pushed those rises and falls across the bond as physical textures. The high, sweet notes became the soft, weightless brush of a feather across a scarred cheek. The low, resonant chords became the deep, comforting warmth of a heavy quilt draped over freezing shoulders. I wove the emotion of the song, the absolute, unconditional love of a protector, and the promise that the dark would eventually break into dawn, directly into the fabric of his consciousness. I poured the song into his mind in rhythmic, undulating waves of color and light, gold and soft lavender washing away the harsh, blinding gray of his past. Kael gasped. His trembling hands gripped my dress. He leaned forward until his forehead rested heavily against my collarbone. As the telepathic music washed over him, the frantic, terrified pacing of his inner wolf finally ceased. His breathing slowed, matching the deliberate, soothing tempo of my mental song. He drank in the melody like a man who had been wandering in a desert for 22 years. There, in the quiet dark of his velvet-lined sanctuary, the bond between us fundamentally shifted. It stopped being a desperate lifeline forged in a moment of terror and hardened into something entirely indestructible. I held the Alpha Heir as he surrendered the last of his walls, singing him to sleep with a voice no one else in the world would ever hear. Morning infiltrated the sanctuary not as a sound, but as a slow, creeping shift in the temperature. The heavy velvet curtains kept the physical light at bay, but through our newly forged tether, I could feel the rigid, dreadful anticipation waking up inside Kael's muscles. It was time for the morning assembly. Attendance in the Great Hall was mandatory for the Alpha King's inner circle, and Kael, despite being treated as a ghost, was required to stand at his father's right hand as a grim, silent monument to the king's burden. Kael stood near the heavy iron-latched door, fully dressed in his dark leathers. He looked back at me sitting on the edge of the massive bed. He didn't want to leave. The bond thrummed with a low, anxious vibration, like a plucked cello string. For 22 years, leaving his room meant walking into a void where he was constantly navigating invisible traps and silent cruelties. I will be right here, I projected to him, wrapping the thought in the mental texture of woven sunlight and the steady rhythm of a calm heartbeat. I won't make a sound. I won't leave this room. He pressed his hand flat against the heavy wood of the door, his golden eyes fixed on mine. I can feel them already, he sent back, a flash of dull gray and the sensation of freezing rain. The staring, the heavy steps. Take me with you, I offered softly. He blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. I closed my eyes and focused on the silver thread between us. Leave the door open in your mind. Let me see what you see. I will be your anchor in the gray. A slow, profound warmth flooded his side of the bond. He gave a single sharp nod, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, and slipped out the door. The heavy lock clicked into place, sealing me inside the acoustic tomb of his quarters. For a moment, I was entirely alone. But then, my physical vision of the dim velvet walls began to overlay with a bright, dizzying double exposure. I gasped, gripping the edge of the mattress as Kael's visual feed flooded my consciousness. I saw the towering stone corridors moving past. I felt the rhythmic, heavy thud of Kael's boots through the floorboards, a physical vibration rather than an auditory one. But more than that, and I felt his posture. Normally, when Kael walked these halls, he hunched his massive shoulders inward. He kept his chin tucked, his eyes fixed firmly on the stone floor to avoid the visual overload of a world that mocked him. He made himself as small and unnoticeable as a man of his size possibly could. But today, with my steady, warm presence anchoring his mind, Kael didn't slouch. "Chin up," I whispered through the bond, sending a pulse of liquid gold and the feeling of a spine made of iron. "You are the heir. Let them see you." Through his eyes, I watched his posture correct. His broad chest expanded, his chin lifted, his jaw setting into a hard, regal line. As he pushed open the massive double doors to the great hall, he didn't look down. He looked straight ahead. The great hall was a cavernous space filled with the king's elite guard, pack elders, and visiting emissaries. To Kael, it was a silent sea of moving mouths and shifting bodies. To me, it was a cacophony of scraping chairs, clinking goblets, and low, murmuring voices. But I didn't translate the noise for him. I simply maintained the steady, calming warmth of my presence, a shield against the overwhelming visual static. Kael walked the length of the hall to his designated place beside the massive, iron-wrought throne. He turned and stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back. A moment later, the Alpha King entered. Even through the telepathic link, the king's aura was suffocating. It felt like the air pressure dropping before a violent hurricane. He was a massive, heavily scarred man with eyes like chipped flint. He moved with arrogant, predatory grace, taking his seat on the throne. As the king settled, his gaze immediately snapped to his left. He looked directly at Kael. Through Kael's eyes, I watched the king's flinty gaze narrow. The king was a master of reading body language. He had to be, to maintain his iron grip on the territory. For over 2 decades, he had looked at his son and seen nothing but a broken tool, a cowering, defective beast. But today, Kael was looking back. His golden eyes were steady, devoid of the usual cloudy resignation. He was standing perfectly straight, his chest rising and falling with measured, calm breaths. The ambient, oppressive terror that the king usually weaponized against his son was simply bouncing off the invisible armor of our bond. The king didn't like it. His jaw tightened, and a muscle feathering near his scar. He leaned forward, his eyes dissecting Kael's stance, searching for the source of this sudden, inexplicable defiance. Kael was a man who lived in the dark. Someone had turned on a light, and the king could see it burning in his son's eyes. Before the king could act on his suspicion, the heavy doors at the far end of the hall opened. 2 elite guards marched forward, dragging a third man between them. It was Silas. I flinched in the quiet of Kael's room. Through the bond, Kael felt my sudden spike of fear. "Hold steady," he projected instantly, wrapping my consciousness in a thick, protective mental blanket. "He cannot reach you." Silas looked horrific. The entire left side of his face was swollen, his jaw jutting at an unnatural, broken angle. He was forced to his knees before the throne, groaning as he hit the stone floor. "Explain this," the king commanded, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I heard it with my physical ears, the sound bleeding slightly into the telepathic link. Silas swallowed hard, wincing in agony. "My king, I was inspecting the lower cellars last night. I found the new Omega Maid stealing from the wine reserves." Liar. The word flared hot and red in my mind, but I bit my lip, staying completely silent. "I moved to discipline her," Silas continued, his words slurred through his shattered jaw. "But she wasn't alone. Someone was waiting in the dark." "They broke down this door and ambushed me before I could draw my blade." The king's eyes flicked to Silas, cold and calculating. "A rogue in my cellars? Impossible. Who was it?" Silas hesitated. A bead of sweat rolled down his bruised cheek. He glanced shiftily toward the dais. For a fleeting second, his terrified gaze landed on Kael, then darted away. Silas was too humiliated to admit the truth in front of the entire assembly, admitting that the deaf, then crippled heir had moved faster than a seasoned beta and shattered his jaw in a single blow would strip Silas of his rank and honor forever. "I couldn't see, my king," Silas lied, looking back at the floor. "It moved too fast. But the Omega, she vanished with him. She must have been conspiring with an intruder." The great hall erupted into low, tense murmurs. An intruder on the Alpha King's estate was an act of war. A missing Omega was a loose end. The king raised a hand, and then the hall fell instantly silent. He didn't look at Silas. Slowly, deliberately, the king turned his head and looked directly at Kael again. The king wasn't a fool. He knew Silas was lying about the intruder. He knew the intricate wards around the fortress would have triggered if a rogue entered the cellars. And he knew that the only person in the entire estate with the raw, brute strength to shatter a beta's jaw and tear iron hinges from stone was his own defective son. But why? Kael had never shown interest in the staff. He had never defended an Omega. He lived entirely in his own hollow world. What could have possibly drawn the deaf monster out of his tower? Through Kael's eyes, I saw the king stand up. He walked slowly across the dais until he was standing chest to chest with his son. The height difference was negligible, but the power dynamic was historically devastating. "Do not react," I prayed through the bond, pushing a wave of absolute stillness into Kael's mind. From Kael's right ear, it was a cruel, from Kael's right ear. It was a cruel, testing gesture, a sudden, sharp noise designed to trigger a flinch. I heard the snap through my own memories of the sound, but Kael felt absolutely nothing. He didn't even twitch. The king sneered, seemingly satisfied that his son was still broken, yet fundamentally unnerved by the unyielding strength in Kael's posture. The king turned his back on Kael and faced the assembly. "A rat has crawled into my walls, and a servant has gone missing," the Alpha King boomed, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "I want the estate locked down. Double the patrols on the perimeter, and send the shadow trackers into every corridor, every servant's quarter, and every abandoned wing." He paused, casting a dark, hiding. "Drag her out. If she resists, kill her. If she is not here, find her. If she is not found, kill me. If she is found, kill her. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If she is not killed, kill me. If she is killed, kill me. If hiding, drag her out. If she resists, kill her. Bring me her head before sunset. In the silence of Kale's sanctuary, my blood ran cold. The hunt had begun. And the king wasn't just looking for a missing maid. He was looking for the reason his son had suddenly learned how to stand like a king. The hunt reached the upper wing by midday. Through the heavy oak doors of Kale's quarters, I could hear the rhythmic thud of armored boots and the sharp, barked orders of the shadow trackers. The king's paranoia had finally outweighed his disgust for his son's territory. They were going to search the room. Kale knew it before I did. The bond hummed with a sudden, sharp urgency. He didn't waste time with projected words. He grabbed my hand, pulled me toward the back of the massive bedchamber, and shoved aside a heavy, floor-to-ceiling velvet tapestry. Behind it was a solid stone wall, but Kale pressed his palm against a slightly discolored brick near the floor. A narrow, vertical sliver of the wall silently swung inward, revealing a pitch-black, suffocatingly tight passageway. It was an old servants' corridor, built centuries ago, so staff could stoke the fires without being seen by the nobility. "Hide," Kyle projected, the mental texture of the command feeling like a shield of hardened steel. Do not come out. No matter what you feel from me, I will lead them away. I squeezed his hand, projecting a pulse of steady, unwavering warmth, and slipped into the darkness. The stone panel clicked shut behind me just as the main doors to Kael's bedchamber crashed open. I held my breath in the suffocating dark, listening to the heavy boots tear Kael's sanctuary apart. I felt his stoic, yet infuriating calm through the bond as the guards overturned his furniture and checked his closets. When they found nothing, the metallic clatter of armor faded down the hall. But I couldn't stay behind Kael's wall. The trackers had hounds, and my scent was still lingering. I had to move deeper into the labyrinth of the estate's bones. I crawled through the narrow, dust-choked passages for hours. The air was stale, smelling of old mortar and dry rot. Spiders scuttled over my hands, and the rough stone tore at the knees of my already ruined dress. I kept my sanity by holding on to the silver thread connecting my mind to Kael's. He was moving through the fortress, intentionally drawing the king's attention, projecting the steady, rhythmic sensation of his heartbeat to keep my panic at bay. The passage began to slope downward, the air growing warmer and carrying the distinct, bitter scent of burnt sage and copper. I crept forward until a sliver of faint, flickering light cut through the gloom. It spilled from a rusted iron grate set into the floor of the tunnel. I carefully positioned myself over the grate, looking down through the iron crosshatches. I was positioned directly above the Alpha King's private study. The king was pacing in front of a massive fireplace, but he wasn't alone. Sitting in a high-backed leather chair was an old woman draped in ragged, dark cloaks. Her skin was painted with intricate, faded runes, and she emanated an aura so foul it made the back of my throat burn. A blood witch.
"The boy stood straight today,"
the king growled, stopping his pacing to glare at the old woman.
"He looked me in the eye. He didn't cower. I want to know if your magic is failing, crone."
The witch let out a dry, rattling laugh.
"A blood curse of that magnitude does not simply fail, Your Majesty. It is woven into the marrow of his bones. It is bound to his very soul."
My blood ran cold, and I pressed my ear against the cold iron grate, my physical heart hammering so violently against my ribs, I feared they would hear it.
"Then why the sudden defiance?"
the king demanded, slamming his fist onto his mahogany desk.
"He has been a broken, deaf beast for 22 years. Exactly as I ordered. But today, the shadow of the man he was supposed to be was looking back at me."
"Perhaps," the witch purred, tracing a rune on her own palm.
The prophecy is simply stronger than your paranoia."
"Do not speak to me of that delusion. It is no delusion, and you know it. That is why you paid me in lichen gold to mutilate your own infant son." The witch shot back, her voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "The seer warned you. Before the heir's first breath, it was written that he would hear the voice of the goddess, a true mate who would awaken his legendary strength and tear down the tyrant's throne. You couldn't kill him without the High Council executing you for kinslaying, so you had me sever his hearing." I slapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a physical gasp. A curse. It wasn't a genetic defect. It wasn't a tragedy of nature. The Alpha King had deliberately deafened his own child to protect his crown. He had condemned his son to a lifetime of absolute agonizing isolation, subjected him to daily beatings and humiliation, all because he was terrified of a prophecy.
If he cannot hear the voice,"
the king sneered, adjusting his heavy gold rings,
"the prophecy cannot be fulfilled. His wolf will remain dormant. He will remain a cripple."
"Magic is like water, Your Majesty," the witch whispered softly. "It finds the cracks, If the boy is standing taller, perhaps the voice did not need physical ears to reach him. I didn't need to hear anymore. The sheer magnitude of the king's betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. I closed my eyes, reaching out into the dark ether of my mind, grabbing hold of the silver thread that bound me to Kael. I didn't translate the words. I didn't send abstract concepts of color or texture. I opened the floodgates and pushed the raw, unfiltered memory of the last 3 minutes directly into his consciousness. I sent him the visual of his father pacing. I sent him the bitter smell of the sage. I sent him the exact, devastating echo of the king admitting to the blood curse. The response was immediate. The bond didn't just vibrate, it violently convulsed. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through my mind, so intense my physical vision whited out. It wasn't just pain. It was the shattering of a son's final, desperate hope that his father's cruelty was just a harsh lesson in strength. Curse. Kael's mental voice was a jagged, bleeding wound. Not broken. Stolen. The silver tether between us flared from a gentle shimmer to a blinding, incandescent white. The grief evaporated in a fraction of a second, instantly incinerated by the birth of an apocalyptic, world-ending rage. Deep in the labyrinth of the fortress walls, I felt the very stone around me begin to tremble. Down in the study below, the Alpha King stopped his pacing, looking up at the ceiling as the heavy crystal chandelier began to violently sway. Kael's wolf was finally waking up. The tremor that shook the king's study did not culminate in immediate bloodshed. Kael's rage was a newly forged weapon, glowing white-hot and volatile, but my presence in his mind tempered the steel. "Wait!" I had begged him through our tether, feeling the raw, chaotic power of his awakened wolf threatening to tear his physical body apart. "If you strike now, they will slaughter us both. We are not ready." He had swallowed the apocalypse. He buried the devastating revelation of his cursed silence deep beneath his stoic, expressionless mask, retreating to his quarters before the king's guards could locate the source of the structural quake. But the Alpha King had felt the shift in the air. Driven by paranoia and the desperate need to reassert dominance over the son he had mutilated, the king summoned Kael to the proving grounds before the sun even reached its peak. It was officially declared a test of the heir's readiness. In reality, it was a public execution of Kael's newfound pride. I navigated the dust-choked servant passages until I reached the high, arched rafters of the Colosseum. Crouched behind a stone gargoyle, looking down through a rusted iron grate, I had a perfect view of the sunken, sand-filled arena. The stands were packed with pack elders, elite warriors, and visiting dignitaries. The Alpha King sat on his elevated balcony, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Below him, Kael stood in the center of the burning white sand. He was stripped to the waist, the harsh midday sun illuminating the crisscrossing silver scars on his broad back. A lifetime of punishments for a silence he never chose. He looked magnificently lethal, but utterly alone. Then, the heavy iron gates at the far end of the arena groaned open. Not one, but 4 of the king's elite vanguard stepped into the sand. They were massive, heavily armored betas wielding blunt, weighted training axes. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. 4 against 1 was not a trial. It was a slaughter, especially against a deaf man who could not hear the crunch of boots behind him or the whistle of a swinging blade. The vanguards didn't hesitate. They fanned out, circling Kael like vultures. They communicated with sharp, barking commands and subtle clicks of their tongues, auditory cues Kael was entirely blind to. They intended to exploit his curse. They intended to break him. I pressed my hands flat against the cold iron grate. closing my eyes and plunging my consciousness entirely into the silver tether. I am here, I projected, washing his mind with a wave of absolute, crystalline focus. I am your ears, Kael. Let me listen for you. Down in the arena, Kael's shoulders relaxed. The tension bled from his stance. He didn't look up at the rafters, but a profound, anchoring warmth flooded back across the bond. He was ready. The vanguard behind Kael made the first move. He lunged forward, his heavy boots kicking up sand, aiming a crippling strike at the back of Kael's knees. I didn't try to translate the sound into words. There was no time. Instead, I translated the auditory warning into a sharp, tactile sensation. Phantom pressure, back of the left calf. Now! Kael moved with terrifying synchronization. A fraction of a second before the axe would have shattered his leg, he pivoted on his heel, dropping low to the sand. The heavy weapon swung harmlessly through empty space. Using his momentum, Kael drove his elbow upward, catching the vanguard squarely in the sternum with the sickening crunch of breaking bone. The man folded, gasping for air, and Kael tossed him aside like a rag doll. The crowd fell dead silent. The king gripped the stone railing of his balcony, his smirk vanishing. The remaining 3 warriors exchanged panicked glances. They had never seen the heir move like that. They abandoned their circling strategy and rushed him simultaneously. The arena became a chaotic symphony of violence, but in Kael's mind, it was a perfectly orchestrated dance. I listened to the shifting of gravel, the intake of breath, the metallic hum of weapons cutting through the air, and I painted the battlefield onto his consciousness. Right side, high arc. I sent a flash of sharp, blinding white to his right temple. Kael ducked seamlessly under a decapitating swing. Behind you, a blade drawn! I projected the feeling of ice sliding down his spine. Kael didn't even turn around. He simply reached backward, catching the attacker's wrist in mid-air, twisting it until the man dropped his weapon with a scream, then kicked him halfway across the arena. It wasn't just a fight. It was a flawless execution of shared consciousness. Every time an opponent tried to use Kael's blind spots against him, I was there, turning his perceived weakness into an impenetrable shield. He blocked strikes he couldn't possibly have anticipated. He dodged weapons he couldn't see. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, his golden eyes burning with the awakened power of his lichen blood. He wasn't just surviving the trial. He was making a mockery of the king's elite guard. The final vanguard, terrified and desperate, tried a cowardly tactic. He scooped up a handful of sand and threw it directly at Kael's face to blind him, following up with a brutal downward strike of his axe. "Close your eyes!" I screamed through the tether. 2 steps left!" Kael shut his eyes, fully surrendering his physical sight to my mental guidance. He stepped smoothly to the left, letting the blinding sand and the heavy axe pass mere inches from his shoulder. While his eyes were still closed, Kael lashed out, his massive fist connecting with the vanguard's jaw in a devastating uppercut. The warrior hit the ground and did not move. The trial was over. It had taken less than 3 minutes. Kael stood alone in the center of the arena, her chest heaving, his knuckles bruised. He hadn't taken a single hit. The silence in the Colosseum was no longer the oppressive quiet of Kael's curse. It was the breathless, terrified awe of hundreds of wolves realizing a monster had just been unchained. On the balcony, the Alpha King was pale, his hands trembling as he stared down at the son he had tried to destroy. The king knew in that exact moment that the curse had failed. Kael was no longer fighting in the dark. Down in the sand, Kael slowly opened his eyes. He didn't look at the carnage at his feet. He didn't look at the furious, terrified king. Instead, he lifted his chin and looked directly up at the high, shadowed rafters. His golden eyes locked onto the exact grate where I was hiding. He couldn't see me in the gloom, but he felt me. Slowly, deliberately, the Alpha Heir offered a single, imperceptible nod of reverence to the only voice in his world. I was already pacing the length of the velvet-lined sanctuary when the heavy iron latch finally clicked. The heavy oak doors opened and closed in a fraction of a second, sealing the outside world away once more. Kael leaned back against the dark wood, his chest heaving. The white sand of the proving grounds still clung to the sweat on his bare chest and dusted the pale, crisscrossing scars on his shoulders. He was entirely uninjured, his knuckles merely bruised from the brutal impacts, but the adrenaline of the arena still radiated off his skin like heat from an open furnace. I didn't hesitate. I crossed the thick carpet and threw my arms around his waist, burying my face against his chest. Our minds collided in a rush of brilliant, swirling gold and steady silver. The telepathic tether, which had been pulled taut with lethal focus during the trial, snapped back into a profound, overwhelming embrace. I felt his awe, his residual fury at the king, and above all, an anchor-deep devotion that threatened to knock the breath from my lungs. Kael's massive arms wrapped around my shoulders, pulling me impossibly close. He buried his face in my hair, inhaling deeply. For a long time, we just stood there, in the absolute physical silence of the room, communicating solely through the rapid, synchronized beating of our hearts and the warm, golden flood of our shared consciousness. We survived, I projected softly, sending him the mental sensation of smooth, calm water. He pulled back just enough to look down at me. The fierce, awakened predator from the arena had vanished, replaced by a profound, almost devastating tenderness. Not survived, his mind corrected, the thought carrying the heavy, solid texture of carved stone. Conquered. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently wiping a smudge of dust from my cheek. But as his fingers brushed the side of my jaw, near my pulse point, his movement slowed. His golden eyes tracked the subtle, a rhythmic flutter of my throat as I breathed. Slowly, the golden warmth in our mental link began to retreat, pulling inward like a receding tide. It wasn't a severing of the bond, but a sudden, intense concentration. Kael dropped his hand from my face and pressed his fingertips against his own throat. He stared at me, his brow furrowing in deep, agonizing focus. I felt a strange, jagged pressure building on his side of the tether. Yet he was analyzing the physical mechanics of my body, remembering how my throat vibrated when I explained the sounds of the fire and the wind, mapping the physical reality of the telepathic music I had poured into his soul. He wanted to bridge the final gap. The curse had stolen his existence in the auditory world, rendering him a ghost in his father's empire. He had fought in the dark, bled in the dark, and lived in the dark. I had given him the light of my mind, but Kael was an alpha. And he didn't just want to receive, he wanted to give it back. He opened his mouth slightly. He forced his chest to expand, drawing in a massive breath, and attempted to push the air upward with intent. The result was a harsh, physical clicking sound deep in his chest. It wasn't speech. It was the raw, mechanical misfire of muscles and cartilage that had lain dormant for 22 years. He winced, a flash of bright, sharp pain spiking through our bond. "Kael, stop," I whispered aloud, reaching up to cover his hand with mine. "You don't have to do this. I hear you perfectly. I hear everything you are." He shook his head fiercely.
He didn't project a single thought back to me. He was deliberately cutting off the telepathic shortcut, forcing his entire being into the physical realm. He stepped closer, backing me gently into the center of the room, away from the door. He took my hand from his throat and moved it, pressing my palm flat against his bare chest, right over his lungs.
Closed his eyes. His jaw setting in a rigid, determined line. I felt the massive muscles in his chest contract under my left hand as he drew in another deep breath. Under my right hand, his throat tightened. It was a brutal, agonizing effort. He was fighting against 2 decades of atrophy and the lingering, dark magic of a blood witch's curse. A low, grating rasp clawed its way up his windpipe. It sounded like 2 heavy stones grinding together. His eyes squeezed tighter, the skin around them whitening with the strain. The pain flaring across our silent bond was immense. A burning, tearing sensation. But he refused to stop. He forced the air higher. He moved his tongue, clumsy and unpracticed, trying to mimic the shape of the physical syllables he had seen on my lips. Ah. The sound was breathy, broken, and completely devoid of pitch, but it fractured the absolute silence of the room. It was the first true vowel the Alpha Heir had ever produced. A tear escaped my eye, tracking hotly down my cheek. I kept my hands pressed firmly against his skin, anchoring him, pouring every ounce of my love and belief into the tactile pressure of my fingertips. Kale's chest heaved. He swallowed hard, fighting past the physical agony in his throat. He opened his glowing golden eyes. The vibration under my palm stuttered. Then caught. It was a jagged, gravelly whisper. It was hoarse, it was painful, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. He had taken my name and made it physical. The effort completely exhausted him. Kael sagged forward. A wave of triumph, exhaustion, and wave of triumph, exhaustion, and overwhelming devotion washing over me. I slid my hands up his neck, tangling my fingers in his dark hair, and pulled his lips down to mine. I kissed him, swallowing the lingering, painful rasp of his first spoken word, trading the silence of our past for the irrefutable, undeniable sound of our future. At the physical toll of the arena, compounded by the agonizing effort of forcing his vocal cords to form my name, eventually dragged Kael into a deep, restorative sleep. I lay beside him for hours in the velvet-lined dark, tracing the outline of his scarred shoulders, listening to the steady, even rhythm of his breathing. The telepathic tether between us had softened into a gentle, golden hum, a quiet pulse of absolute safety. But safety did not fill a hollow stomach. Kael had burned through a massive amount of energy during the trial, and we had been locked in his sanctuary without provisions since the morning. If we were going to survive what was inevitably coming, he needed his strength. Careful not to wake him, I slipped from the heavy furs of the bed. I closed my eyes and visualized a thick, impenetrable wall of gray stone within my own mind, deliberately muting my side of the bond. I didn't want my anxiety to bleed through and disturb his rest. I pressed the hidden brick near the floorboards, slipped into the suffocating chill of the servants' passages, and began the long descent toward the estate's lower pantries. The midnight watch was usually the safest time to scavenge. The vast kitchens, typically a chaotic inferno of shouting cooks and clattering iron, were dark and silent. The only light came from the dying embers of the massive hearths. I moved like the ghost they all thought I was, keeping to the shadows as I slipped into the cold storage. I quickly gathered a loaf of hardened bread, a wedge of cheese, and wrapped a few strips of dried venison in a clean linen cloth. I was turning back toward the servants' entrance when the heavy wooden door of the pantry swung shut with a definitive, echoing crack. A lantern flared to life, casting harsh, yellow light across the stone floor. Standing in the doorway was Greta, the bitter, the sharp-eyed head housekeeper who had shoved my uniform at me on my very first day. She held the lantern high, her lip curling in a triumphant sneer. Behind her stood 2 armored estate guards. I knew the rats would come out if we waited long enough. Greta spat, stepping fully into the room. I froze, the stolen food clutched desperately to my chest. I considered dropping it and running, but the guards had already unhooked the heavy iron chains from their belts. Greta stepped closer, the lantern light illuminating her cruel features. She leaned in, her nose wrinkling as she drew in a deep breath. Omegas were taught to suppress their scents to remain invisible, but I hadn't been invisible for the last 48 hours. I had been wrapped in the arms of the Alpha Heir. Greta's eyes widened in sudden, malicious comprehension. "You reek of pine and ozone," she whispered, her voice dripping with disgust. "You smell like the upper wing, like the deaf beast." Panic, a cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I instantly threw every ounce of my willpower into maintaining the mental wall I had built across the tether. "Sleep, Kael," I prayed into the void, terrified that my spike of fear would wake him and draw him straight into an ambush. "Do not wake up." "Take her," Greta ordered the guards. "The king has been turning the fortress inside out for this little thief." The guards seized me, their iron gauntleted hands biting brutally into my bruised arms. They didn't drag me to the dungeons. They dragged me upward, out of the servants' quarters, through the grand, torch-lit corridors, and straight to the heavy oak doors of the Alpha King's private study. The room smelled faintly of the burnt sage the Blood Witch had used earlier. The king was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, nursing a goblet of dark wine. He looked exhausted, the paranoia of the day's events wearing deep lines into his face. Greta shoved me to the floor before the desk. "We caught her stealing from the lower pantries, Your Majesty. The missing Omega." The king slowly set his goblet down. The ambient terror in the room was a physical weight, pressing me flat against the intricate rug. He stood, walking slowly around the edge of the desk until he was towering over me. "Leave us," the king commanded. Greta and the guards bowed hastily and retreated, the heavy doors clicking shut behind them. The king did not strike me, and he simply stared down at me with eyes like chipped flint. He began to slowly circle me, his heavy boots silent on the rug. "Silas said he was ambushed by an intruder while trying to discipline you," the king murmured, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "But the perimeter wards were never breached. Then, my defective son, a boy who has cowered from his own shadow for 2 decades, suddenly moves with the precision of a seasoned warlord in the arena." He stopped pacing, crouching down so his face was level with mine. "I watched him in the sand today," the king said softly. "He blocked strikes from blind spots. He dodged blades he couldn't possibly have anticipated. And when the slaughter was over, he didn't look at me. He looked up at the rafters. He reached out, his massive, ringed hand gripping my chin in a vice, forcing me to look into his terrifying eyes. A deaf man cannot anticipate a blade from behind unless someone tells him it is coming," the king hissed. "And since the crone assured me her curse is not broken, there is only one explanation." I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting the urge to open the telepathic bond, fighting the urge to scream for Kael,
I had to protect him. You didn't just witness his rebellion, the Alpha King breathed, a twisted, horrified realization dawning on his face. He released my chin, is standing back up as if I had burned him. The seer warned me of the voice of the goddess, the mate who would awaken his strength. The king let out a harsh, breathless laugh that held absolutely no humor. He didn't magically heal, the king declared, his eyes burning with a lethal paranoid fire. You are in his mind. You are his ears. You are the voice. He drew the heavy silver blade from his belt, the metal singing a deadly high-pitched note in the quiet study. Let us see how the beast fights, the king sneered, raising the blade, when I cut out his tongue. The sky above the execution courtyard bled the color of a fresh bruise as they dragged me toward the center. The air was razor-sharp, thick with the scent of frost and the metallic tang of old blood that stained the heavy wooden chopping block. The Alpha King had not wasted time with a trial. When the moment he understood I was the voice, the missing piece to his son's awakened power, he had mobilized his entire guard. They hadn't just come for me. They had swarmed Kael's sanctuary while he slept, using the element of surprise and obscene amounts of liquid silver to subdue him. Now, Kael was anchored between two massive stone pillars opposite the execution block. My breath caught in my throat at the sight of him. Thick, heavy chains forged from pure silver wrapped around his wrists, his chest, and his neck. The toxic metal was actively burning him, hissing as it seared into his flesh, sending thin ribbons of acrid smoke into the frigid morning air. He was on his knees, his muscles straining against the restraints with such force that the stone pillars groaned. His golden eyes were locked onto me, wild and utterly devastated. The telepathic tether between us was a chaotic, blinding storm of his physical agony and his soul-crushing terror. Yet he was fighting the chains with everything he had, but the silver was sapping his lichened strength, poisoning his blood faster than he could heal. The king stood on the raised dais overlooking the block, his thick fur cloak wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He looked down at Kael, his expression a mask of cold, triumphant malice. He wanted Kael to watch. He wanted to sever the bond by severing my head, plunging his son back into the absolute, broken silence forever. A guard shoved me hard between the shoulder blades, forcing me to my knees before the scarred wooden block. The executioner, a towering brute draped in black leather, stepped forward, hefting a massive, double-bladed axe. Arya! Kael's mental scream tore through my consciousness, a soundless howl that brought tears to my eyes. No, I will kill them. I will tear the world apart. Arya, please! I looked at the executioner's axe, then up at Kael. The silver was eating him alive. If he kept fighting the chains in his human form, the metal would stop his heart before the blade even touched my neck. I couldn't let my last moments be filled with his despair. I refused to die cowering, and I absolutely refused to let the king win. Kael needed strength. He needed the one thing the king had spent 22 years trying to keep from him. I closed my eyes, tuning out the harsh laughter of the guards and the biting cold of the stone beneath my knees. I focused entirely on the crackling, golden thread that tethered my soul to Kael's. I didn't send him a lullaby to soothe him. I didn't send him the soft colors of the wind or the warmth of the fire. I reached into the deepest, most primal core of my spirit and grasped the ancient lichen battle hymn, a relentless, thundering rhythm I had felt vibrating through the floorboards of the fortress on the nights the king's armies prepared for war. I didn't just sing it, I weaponized it. I pushed the hymn across the bond, translating the rhythm into the sensation of an unstoppable avalanche, the low,
Guttural chords became the rumble of an earthquake. The high, fierce notes became the blinding strike of lightning. I poured every ounce of my love, my defiance, and my unyielding belief in his power straight into his mind. "You are the king," I projected, the words riding the violent crest of the telepathic music. "You are the monster they fear. Show them the dark." The surge of raw erupting into a blinding, incandescent fire that seemed to bleed out into the morning air. The Alpha King raised his hand, signaling the executioner to drop the axe. But as the heavy blade began its descent, the sheer, catastrophic volume of my mental song violently collided with the dark magic woven into Kael's bones. The prophecy the king had tried so desperately to cheat could not be contained by a witch's spell. Inside Kael's mind, the blood curse shattered. It didn't just fade, it exploded like a glass cage struck by a falling anvil. For the first time in his entire life, the physical world rushed into Kael's ears. He heard the sharp intake of my breath. He heard the cruel sneer of the king. He heard the whistle of the heavy axe cutting through the frozen air above my neck. The sensory overload didn't paralyze him. It was the final spark needed to ignite the powder keg of his dormant bloodline. A roar ripped from Kael's throat. Not a rasping, breathless whisper, but a physical, earth-shattering roar that shook the snow from the fortress rooftops. It was the sound of a god waking up in chains. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Kael's physical form violently expanded, our bones cracking and reshaping in a microsecond as he shifted completely into his full lichen form. He became a towering 9-foot nightmare of rippling black fur, elongated limbs, and massive razor-sharp claws. The thick silver chains, designed to hold a heavily muscled man, stood no chance against the primordial strength of the supreme lichen. With a single, brutal flex of his arms, Kael snapped the silver links as if they were made of brittle glass. Shrapnel exploded across the courtyard. The executioner paused mid-swing, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He never completed the downward strike. Kael crossed the 50 yards of the courtyard in a single, blurring leap. He landed directly on the execution block, his massive claws sinking into the wood right beside my cheek. Before the executioner could even drop his axe to run, Kael's jaws clamped around the brute's torso. With a sickening crunch and a violent toss of his head, Kael threw the massive man 30 feet into the stone wall of the dais. Chaos erupted. Guards screamed, drawing their weapons, but Kael simply stood over me, straddling my trembling body to shield me. The massive black lichen let out a deafening, blood-chilling snarl that echoed off the stone walls, his glowing golden eyes locking directly onto his horrified father. The silent air was gone. The monster had arrived. The execution courtyard devolved into absolute pandemonium. The guards who had spent their lives terrorizing the weak now scrambled backward, dropping their silver-tipped halberds as the monstrous 9-foot lichen standing over me let out a second, foundation-shaking roar. Kael did not look at them. His glowing, incandescent golden eyes remained locked on the raised dais. The Alpha King stood frozen, the heavy fur of his cloak whipping in the frigid wind. For the first time in his tyrannical reign, the color had completely drained from his scarred face. Kael stepped off the wooden block. His counter done? Kael stepped off the wooden block, his massive, clawed feet crunching heavily into the frost-covered stone. Every step he took resonated with a terrifying, primal weight. Through our tether, the mental landscape was a storm of unprecedented magnitude. Kael was experiencing physical sound for the first time, not as a translated concept of color or pressure, but as raw, chaotic vibration. The clang of dropped weapons, the panicked shouts of the vanguard, the howling wind. It was a cacophony that should have paralyzed a mind unaccustomed to the auditory world. But I was still there. I anchored my consciousness deep into his, acting as a mental filter. Focus, I projected, pulling the chaotic noise of the courtyard into a dull, unmanageable roar in his mind, leaving only the sharp, distinct sound of his father's heartbeat. Only him. I have the rest. The king realized there was no guard loyal enough to stand between him and the supreme lichen. With a furious, desperate snarl, the tyrant tore away his heavy cloak. His bones snapped and violently realigned as he shifted into his own wolf form, a massive iron-gray beast covered in the thick, silver scars of 100 conquests. The gray wolf launched himself from the dais, jaws snapping toward Kael's throat. The collision of the two alphas shook the very bedrock of the fortress. It was not a duel of honor. It was an execution of the past. The king fought with the desperate, vicious cruelty of a cornered tyrant, but Kael fought with the unstoppable, catastrophic force of a soul that had been caged for 2 decades. Kael absorbed the king's initial impact, his massive lichen form barely sliding backward on the icy stones. He didn't fight defensively. He reached out with terrifying speed, his claws sinking deep into the thick fur and muscle of his father's shoulders. The sound of the battle was deafening. The gnashing of teeth, the heavy, wet tearing of flesh, the guttural roars that rattled the windows of the upper wing. Kael was hearing it all, the brutal, ugly reality of violence. But beneath the noise, he moved with the flawless precision we had perfected in the arena. The king lunged for Kael's blind side, snapping his jaws toward Kael's ribs. Kael didn't need my mental warning this time. He heard the shift of gravel. He heard the intake of breath. With a brutal, sweeping strike of his massive arm, Kael backhanded the iron-gray wolf out of the air. The king crashed into the heavy stone of the dais, the impact cracking the ancient masonry. Before the tyrant could recover his footing, Kael was on him. The black lichen pinned the gray wolf to the frozen earth, his massive jaws wrapping entirely around the king's throat. Silence fell over the courtyard. The frantic scrambling of the guards ceased. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Kael did not bite down immediately. He held the tyrant there, his golden eyes blazing with the weight of 22 years of stolen time, beatings, and crushing isolation. The king whined, a pathetic, suffocated sound of utter defeat, his iron-gray body going limp in submission. The tyrant was yielding the throne. But a yielded throne would never erase the Blood Witch's curse, nor the axe that had almost severed my neck. Through the bond, I felt the exact moment Kael made his choice. It wasn't born of madness or uncontrollable rage. It was a cold, absolute execution of justice. With a sickening, definitive crunch that echoed off the high fortress walls, Kael ended the tyrant's reign. He released his grip, stepping back from the lifeless body of the former king. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. A courtyard. One by one, they dropped to courtyard. One by one, they dropped to their knees in the snow, bowing their heads, exposing their necks to the supreme lichen. The pack had recognized its true master. Kael didn't look at them. His massive head turned, his glowing eyes finding me where I still knelt by the execution block. The adrenaline of the battle began to rapidly drain from his system, replaced by the crushing, overwhelming reality of his newly repaired senses. He stumbled forward, the sheer volume of the physical world finally catching up to him. His bones began to crack and reform as he forcefully shifted back into his human skin. He collapsed to his hands and knees on the freezing stone, his chest heaving, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He immediately brought his hands up, pressing the heels of his palms tightly against his ears, squeezing his eyes shut against the barrage of auditory input. I scrambled up from the wood, my knees bruised and shaking, and ran to him. I dropped to the stones beside him, wrapping my arms fiercely around his trembling bare shoulders. The silver burns across his chest and wrists were already beginning to slowly knit together under the power of his awakened healing. But his mind was overwhelmed. "I am here," I projected softly, weaving a thick, insulated blanket of mental warmth over his consciousness, dampening the harsh scrape of the wind and the rustling of the kneeling guards. Kael shuddered, leaning his heavy weight against me. Slowly, he lowered his hands from his ears. He turned his face into the crook of my neck, his breath ghosting over my collarbone. The curse was completely gone. The dark magic that had severed his connection to the world was nothing but ash in the wind. His physical ears were raw, new, and painfully sensitive. I pulled back just enough to look at his face. His golden eyes fluttered open, searching mine with a desperate, beautiful vulnerability. He wasn't the monster who had just torn a tyrant apart. He was just Kael. He reached up, his calloused thumb gently tracing the line of my jaw, coming to rest lightly against my throat, right over my vocal cords. He didn't speak. He didn't project a thought. He just waited, his eyes pleading. I smiled, tears welling up and spilling over my lashes, freezing on my cheeks. I let the telepathic bond between us fall entirely silent. No translated colors, no projected warmth, just the absolute quiet of two souls occupying the same space. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold morning air, and parted my lips. "I love you." The words were soft, spoken aloud into the biting wind. It was a physical sound, carried on sound waves, vibrating through the air and entering his ears. Kael gasped. His eyes widened, shining with an emotion so profound it defied the limits of language. The frequency of my physical voice, the pitch, the tone, the slight waver of my tears, matched the golden, radiant light I had poured into his mind perfectly. A ragged, breathless laugh broke from his chest. It was a real laugh,
rich and deep, the first true sound of joy he had ever made. He pulled me against his chest, burying his face in my hair, holding me as if I were the very gravity keeping him tethered to the earth. He had won the throne. He had conquered an empire. But as the new Alpha King held his mate in the center of the kneeling courtyard, the only thing that mattered was the beautiful, undeniable music of a world he could finally hear. Epilogue. The fortress was no longer a tomb of silence. In the 3 years since Kael took the throne, the suffocating, heavy dread that had choked the estate vanished, replaced by the warm, a vibrant hum of a pack that was finally allowed to live. The heavy velvet curtains in Kael's sanctuary were pulled back permanently, allowing the bright golden sunlight to spill across the thick carpets. Kael's transition into the auditory world had been overwhelming at first. For months, the crash of a dropped plate or the sudden bark of a hound would cause him to flinch, his hand instinctively reaching for the telepathic tether to my mind for translation. But I was always there, anchoring him, guiding him through the chaotic symphony of physical sound until it became second nature. He fell in love with the noise of the world. He would stand on the balconies for hours just to listen to the howling wind through the pine trees, closing his eyes as if he were drinking in a miracle. He loved the crackle of the hearth, the rhythmic thud of his warriors training in the courtyard, and the soft, steady cadence of my breathing while we slept. But his favorite sound, the one that still brought a reverent glowing amber to his eyes, was one that hadn't existed 3 years ago. I stood in the doorway of our sunlit chambers, leaning against the heavy oak frame, a profound warmth expanding in my chest. Kael was sitting on the edge of the massive bed, his broad, scarred back to me. He was no longer the hunched, defensive boy who expected a blow from the dark. He sat tall, his shoulders relaxed, radiating the calm, undeniable authority of a true Alpha King. In his massive, calloused hands, resting gently against his chest, was our 6-month-old son. The pup had Kael's dark hair and my pale skin. He was awake, his tiny fists waving in the air as he let out a sudden high-pitched babble, a bright, chiming sound of pure innocence. Kael didn't miss a single note. He lowered his head, pressing his nose affectionately against the baby's cheek. "I know," Kael murmured aloud. "I hear you, little wolf. I hear you, little wolf. I hear everything." The baby giggled, a tiny, joyous sound that echoed off the ancient stone walls. Kael closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek, catching the sunlight before it fell. He wasn't crying from sorrow. He was crying because he held the future in his hands, and for the first time in his bloodline, a father was listening. I walked across the plush carpet, my footsteps soft but no longer hidden. Kael heard my approach. He didn't flinch. He simply turned his head, his golden eyes finding mine, filled with an unconditional, universe-altering love. I sat beside him, resting my head on his broad shoulder, wrapping my arms around his waist as we both listened to the beautiful, unbroken music of our family. The curse was a lifetime behind us. The silence was gone forever. If Kael and Arya's journey brought tears to your eyes, you are not alone. This story is a reminder that sometimes the loudest screams are the ones no one else can hear. It's about the soul-crushing weight of feeling invisible, broken, or defective,
and the breathtaking miracle of finding that one person who doesn't just look at you, but truly listens to your heart. Kael lived in a dark, silent hell, and Arya was a battered ghost hiding in the shadows. But together, they proved that true mates don't just survive the darkness, they become the light that shatters it. They remind us that the right love will break any curse, shatter any chain, and give you a voice when the world has tried to silence you. Did Kael and Arya's story touch your soul? If you felt the heartbreak, the rage, and the overwhelming triumph of this mate bond, please take a second to like this video and leave a comment below. What was your favorite moment? Did Kael's first spoken word make you cry? Let me know. Don't let the story end here. If you crave more deep, emotional, tear-jerker werewolf stories where the underdogs rise, the broken find their mates, and the alphas learn what true love really costs, subscribe to the channel right now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter of romance, betrayal, and ultimate redemption. Thank you, and I will see you in my next story.